Okay, so our speaker for today is in line with our international approach. His name is Dr. Paul Warmington. He's Deputy Director of the Center for Research in Race and Education at the University of Birmingham, England, the only university-based center in England dedicated to researching race equality in education. Dr. Warmington's educational work began in the 1980s when, as a publisher and distributor, he worked with Black and anti-racist educators and campaigners across the United Kingdom. He subsequently taught in an inner-city community college, focusing on widening access to higher education among underrepresented groups. He then entered academia, specializing in education studies. Over the past 25 years, Dr. Warmington has taught, written, and researched extensively on race, education, and social justice. His current research interests include critical theories of race and racism, Black Atlantic intellectual histories, and Black British education movements. His most recent book, Black British Intellectuals in Education, Multiculturalism's Hidden History, released by Routledge earlier this year. It focuses on the pioneering work of Black British educators. So, if you would please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Paul Warmington. We're going to use the slides so you can turn the stage. Yeah, there we go. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much and good morning. And it's refreshing to hear, or comforting to hear Dr. Marks telling you to check your college emails, because that's the same thing that I'm saying 3,000 miles away every week. So you cross the Atlantic, nothing changes. It truly is an honor, however, to be here today at the college at the International Colloquium on Black Men in Education, to be here at the Crown Forum, to be here at Morehouse. And it truly is a pleasure also to be here with you in this room, to be here with a room full of excellent, committed Black scholars. It doesn't happen too often in the UK, I can tell you that, and never on this scale. So I'd like to thank Dr. Jolanda Jackson, Dr. James Moore, and Dr. Bryant Marks for their invitation. I'd like to thank also Lisa Hebden for helping me settle in. I'd like to thank all involved in organizing this Crown Forum, and it really, really is a lifetime experience for me to be here. I'd like also to thank my father for allowing me to leave England, because I'm 50 years old now, but my father still likes to look out for me, which is one of the reasons that I'm here today, I guess. And I told him I was so excited to be coming here to the colloquium. I'm coming to Atlanta. I told him, it's in Georgia, it's in the South. And when I told him I was coming to the South, his face just fell, and I could see him looking very, very worried. And I had to spend the next 20 minutes convincing him that I would really be safe if I came to Georgia. But at the same time, my dad also loves me coming to America, because he always says to me, in America, Black people can become anything. They can do anything they want. And that tells you something about the contradictory way in which Black people in Britain, I think, view America. That either you're Barack Obama or else you're being billy clubbed somewhere in Mississippi, And it's kind of a caricature, but there's something heartfelt there. Now, we stand here today in the halls of Morehouse College, and it is an institution for which there is no equivalent in my own country. And that's something of which I'm keenly aware. Moreover, I think the absence of a certain kind of Black tradition or hinterland is something of which all Black educators in Britain are in some sense aware. And this paper today is about the work of creating a sense of Black presence in education rather than absence or deficit. It's about rejecting the suppression of Black history in Britain and about understanding the role that Black communities have played as agents of social change in the field of education. It is also about encouraging young Black people to rethink themselves, to reimagine themselves as intellectuals and social agents. In other words, I want, with young Black men in particular in mind today, to address one of Morehouse's great dictums, one which says, your first step is to define yourself, your destiny is to redefine the world. And I've tried in some small way in my work to address that by chronicling histories of social agency, Black social agency in Britain, and in particular, histories of Black educational struggle in Britain, and the sense of critical hope, as I call it, that has driven those struggles. And as I talk about this chronicling project today, I want to draw attention to some parallels and some tensions between African American and Black British intellectual histories. So, before I go any further, let me give some pointers on what I mean when I talk about Black communities in Britain. There have been people of African descent in Britain since Roman times. And in Elizabethan times, there were enough black people for Queen Elizabeth I to sign a proclamation attempting to expel all blackamoors from England. The reasons she gave were twofold, the same reasons that you always hear, even today in Britain. One was that black people are coming to England in the 16th century to take our jobs, and the other one was they're coming to live off our welfare. Nothing changes. And by the late 18th century in Britain, there were small but established communities in port cities such as Cardiff and Liverpool. However, as many of you will know, the bulk of Britain's black population was established in the 1950s and 1960s, when there was mass migration from the Commonwealth in response to government recruitment drives to enable the rebuilding of health services, transport services, and commerce in the aftermath of World War II. For most of the late 20th century, Caribbean communities formed the core of black Britain, although in the last few years, black Africans have outnumbered Caribbeans, and biracial people are one of the fastest increasing groups. And it's been these black communities that have faced the harshest struggles over education and who have identified schooling as a site of political struggle again and again. Now in Britain, people of colour, as you call us here, we often refer to, in Britain, to BME people, to people of black, minority and ethnic descent. BME people in Britain comprise around 9% of the total British population. And of those, black Caribbean people, black African people, and those who in the USA might be referred to as biracial account for just over 3.3% of the population, around 1.8 million. So let me think about black intellectuals here. And let's think first about black life as intellectual life. Now, if you ask any moderately interested Briton to name a black intellectual, the chances are the response will be an American name, whether it's Malcolm or Toni Morrison or Cornel West. But Britain also has its own black intellectual traditions and its own master teachers, amongst them people like C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones, and Stuart Hall. And black Britain's intellectual flow has encompassed dialogues with the Enlightenment, with Marxism, with feminism, post-colonialism, and postmodernism. However, while in the USA, black intellectuals are an embedded, if often embattled, feature of national life, black thinkers in Britain remain routinely marginalised, often barely visible. In UK education and social policy in particular, black intellectual life is seldom acknowledged. Black expertise is seldom acknowledged. And it is still too often assumed that black communities are problems to be interpreted and theorised by white intellectuals. And Britain as a whole pays the cost of that neglect. And no one has paid more than young black men who may grow up into an image of themselves as marginal and as bit part players rather than true agents of social change. And to try to help redress this misrecognition, I recently published a book called Black Intellectuals and Education. And it focuses on black education as political struggle in Britain. However, I prefaced it somewhat perversely with a quote from a great American scholar, Manning Marable, from his book Dispatches from the Ebony Tower. And to an extent, I modeled my own quest on Marable's, in that I wanted to explore how black intellectuals have confronted black experience in Britain and how their work lies within wider traditions of black Atlantic thought. And Marable said, "The purpose of black scholarship is more than restoration of identity and self-esteem. It is to use history and culture as tools through which people may interpret their collective experience, but for the purpose of transforming their actual conditions and the totality of the society all around them." And in chronicling the work of black intellectuals and activists in Britain, what I want to contribute to is a transformation of the way that black life is depicted and understood, particularly in Britain's education system, wherein black people are too often seen either as victims or problems. And for some of our young people, and I guess it's the same here also, particularly for black men, this problem-victim paradigm has become a straitjacket. And this problem-victim paradigm, I shall argue, is fundamentally linked to a misrecognition of the ways in which black British identities have formed around education since the middle of the last century. Now, struggles over what it means to be black and British have been enacted repeatedly around sites of education, educational desire and educational despair. And here I would say there is a clear parallel between black people in Britain and in the USA. And when I'm asked why I focus on education as a site with which to explore race, identity, and social justice, there are 4 historical reasons to which I point. The first is that black thinkers, educators, and activists have helped to fundamentally shape educational policy and practice and philosophy. And we should remember that black activists and intellectuals have often broken new ground long before the policymakers, not only around so-called black education, but also more generally around approaches to curriculum, school and community relations, and access to higher education. Secondly, the second reason is that the understandings that black intellectuals have developed about education and about social justice are not just transient responses to the vagaries of education policy. They are rooted in longer histories of black intellectual production, which need to be understood if we are to avoid trivializing debates around black life, debates around race and education. Thirdly, education is one of the significant fields in which black British intellectual positions have been defined and differentiated in the past century, because black intellectual production has never been tidy or homogeneous, certainly not where education is concerned. And lastly, education is one of the key spaces in which the mass consciousness of being black and British originated. And I remember growing up in the 70s and in the early 80s, a time when it was still difficult almost to say that you were black British. And that last point about identities, black and British identities emerging around sites of education is worth emphasizing, because while education is cited almost incidentally as being formative to black British experiences, particularly in the post-war period, existing large-scale histories of race and education often give surprisingly limited attention to the role of education. And one consequence of this hidden history has been the relegation of some of the seminal figures in black British intellectual life, such as the pioneering civil rights activist Harold Moody, or the educational activist John LaRose and his New Beacon Circle. And it has meant also that the political and intellectual sophistication of Britain's black communities has tended to be underestimated. And what is hidden in those bleached histories, is a sense of the social agency of black communities. The loss of that history of social agency, I would argue, constrains black identities, and particularly educational identities, and the identities and possibilities for self-realization of black males, who, as in many parts of the USA, public school sector, are regarded primarily as a policy problem. And I'm arguing that a particular link exists between ahistorical views of black communities and the problematization of black men in education in Britain. Now, Paul Gilroy, one of our leading critical theorists who has worked both in Britain and in the USA, once made a profound argument. He wrote that racism works to suppress the historical dimensions of black life, offering a mode of existence locked permanently into a recurrent present where social existence is confined to the role of either being a problem or a victim, that problem-victim paradigm that I talked about. And in my own writing, I argue that one of the constraints facing black educators and students and communities in Britain is a kind of short-sighted policy presentism, where black social life is made always symbolic of a kind of newness and is understood in various voguish policy terms, under achievement, standards, educational choice, or community cohesion. These are the murky terms in which black life and learning tends to be understood today. So Britain is still most comfortable viewing black communities, and especially black children and young people, as problems and victims. And one of the ways it does this is by denying black British history and black educational history. So that when Britain writes its histories of education and social policy, it rarely sees black communities as social actors, as activists, as campaigners, and thinkers who have shaped the education system. So, some of the points that I want to cover here. First of all, let's think about black intellectuals again. Now, in Britain, even to talk of black intellectuals, and in particular black British intellectuals, can provoke controversy in ways that I think educated readers in America would find remarkable. One reason is that education and social policy, as well as in popular debate, yet in that sphere, it is still too often assumed that black communities are problems to be interpreted by white intellectuals, as I said earlier. And needless to say, that assumption is deeply rooted in ideas that equate the mind, the intellect, philosophy, theory with whiteness. Now, some 30 years ago in this country, the American critical race scholar Richard Delgado published a paper called The Imperial Scholar. And in it, Delgado examined the ways in which writing on US civil rights law was dominated by a powerful circle of white scholars who routinely cited other white scholars and used white scholars to mediate and understand their field, while the voices of black thinkers and the thorny problems of race and social justice they raised were continually marginalized. It's a case of keep quiet, we are talking about you, not to you. But among black academic audiences too, my talking about black British intellectuals sometimes provokes nervousness, even indignation. And this is usually prompted by the assumption that when I talk about black intellectuals, I am talking solely about black academics, and therefore, in British terms, being elitist. Because we have a great fear in Britain of black elitism. And some of it may be justified, but I've always found it a curious fear, given that in Britain, believe me, we don't have a black elite. In fact, Britain is perhaps the only part of the Black Atlantic in which the very idea of black thinkers, of black intellectuals, causes consternation. Which is not to say, of course, that black intellectuals or any other kind of intellectual is an unproblematic figure. Indeed, it is perhaps the reflex action, if not the duty, of black intellectuals to strain against that descriptor and the myriad conflicts it invokes. But no, I am not speaking solely of academics when I refer to black intellectuals, but rather black public intellectuals, what Fanon or Gramsci conceived of as organic intellectuals. The black intellectuals, activists, and campaigners whose work I have researched encompass a considerable range of philosophies, strategies, and specific campaigns. Some have found a home in academia, yes, but others are artists and journalists, political figures. And in my own field of education, there are those that emerged to challenge specific educational injustices, such as disproportionate school exclusions, and those concerned with setting up community education, those that have worked in alliances with churches, arts projects, trade unions, those that have worked to make available anti-racist resources or new sociological approaches, and to promote black literature and history. All of these I encompass under the definition of black intellectuals and black public intellectuals. So, what is it that these black intellectuals do and say insofar as they speak of black life and social justice? Now, here in the USA, Charles Banner Haley argues that historically, African American intellectuals have been above all public intellectuals. And that is true of black British intellectuals also. In delineating African American intellectual traditions, the late Manning Marable referred to three great points of departure. He characterized the work of black public intellectuals as, firstly, descriptive, that is, concerned with depicting the realities of black life through black perspectives, though not through crude and critical advocacy. As corrective, that is, aiming to critique racist values and representations and challenge theories of white supremacy, and to make visible the endemic presence of racism within the social and political formation. And Marable described their work as prescriptive, that is, engaged in activist scholarship that maps out practical possibilities for social change, for black empowerment, and the dismantling of racialized social structures. And these aims, I think, can be seen too across centuries of British endeavor, black British endeavor. But in the British context, I think we can offer a fourth dimension also, one that might be termed the co-creative or co-constructive role. For any black British public intellectual bearing witness or plotting action or offering critique has also had to answer the question, well, who are they, the black British? What do you mean when you say black British? And this task has weighed on black British thinkers in a way that it is perhaps not quite weighed upon black Americans. And that's not to trivialize the struggles waged among African Americans to define themselves since emancipation. However, the historical challenge of defining what it means to be black and British seems of a more literal order. I've got a heading here called, strangely, Black British Envy. Now, I don't wish to plead poverty, and I don't wish to idealize American society, but I will say this. Black Britain has, I think, a profound envy of African American intellectual history. Not resentment, but envy. Black British scholars and educators and artists and political campaigners so often look to the USA, and we compare ourselves somewhat unfavorably in terms of public profile, status, political influence, and class composition, academic achievement, and so forth. And again, this comes to me also when I look at a place like Morehouse. And again, when I think about Morehouse, there is no British equivalent. Nothing comes near to the kind of work that you do here. And it occurs to me also that what we Black Britons envy too is that sense of an African-American hinterland, as I call it. That is, when Black leaders and scholars and artists speak in this country, they are able to appear or to invoke a deeply rooted, shared history, and they have a sense of an established Black public that exists not only in the immediate present, but which is long-standing and assumes a common history that threads, albeit in complex ways, across 400 years. So when Black speakers speak in the USA, they have a sense of Black audience, of readership, of public that exists only tenuously in Britain. Now, of course, as one corner of the Black Atlantic, we in Britain share common history with African Americans. Many Black Britons have family branches here, some of us have worked and studied here, and almost all of us who are scholars and educators and activists are steeped in dialogue with African American thought. It's what we grew up on. And those dialogues are real at so many levels. And you can ask many of us, myself certainly, and we'll tell you the first Black writing that we read was African American. And also, of course, we share claims, equal claims on many figures, such as Garvey and C.L.R. James, Kwame Anthony Appiah, and so forth. And beyond that, there are connections that are visceral, that are certainly built into my childhood. And when I was a child, any Black home, any West Indian home, because we were still called West Indians in those days in Britain, any home I went into would have a portrait of Martin Luther King on the wall and maybe a vinyl record of his speeches. And I'm talking about homes here that were working class neighborhood homes. But those people, my father's generation, they still understood themselves as part of the Black Atlantic. That's how they understood themselves. So let me talk about education specifically. In Britain in the past decade, we have achieved some dire benchmarks in educational inequalities around race. In our university sector, we have something called the Russell Group, which is our rough equivalent to the Ivy League. And it's a group of the 17 elite research-based universities. It includes Oxford, Cambridge, University of London, Durham, Birmingham is another one. And as of 2011, there were more Black men of African Caribbean descent in our prisons than in those elite universities. And there are other, less dramatic measures of the shrinking of Black male educational experiences in Britain. At the age of 16, for instance, at the end of compulsory schooling, Black males of Caribbean and mixed descent are the lowest achieving of the main minority ethnics, even though, by many measures, when Black children enter school at the age of 5, they are ahead of most other groups. So Black children in Britain go from being amongst the top achievers at the age of 5 to among the lowest by the age of 16. And we have elsewhere in our university sector what we call the new universities. And they're good universities, but they're of recent vintage. They were often previously vocation and training orientated, and they tend to draw local students, more mature, return-to-learn students, and students who have not come through traditional qualification routes. And they do an important job, and often an excellent job. But inevitably, they don't carry the status of those elite Russell Group universities. And it is worth noting, therefore, that in just one of our new community universities, the University of East London, there are more Black Caribbean students than the entire Russell Group put together. And if we look at the history of Black educational struggles in Britain, I would say we can perceive an arc in the way that the education system and the policy system has perceived the Black presence. In policy terms, insofar as there has been coherent policy, the arc curves like this. It begins in the 1960s, and the initial concerns in the 1960s were over numbers of Black pupils and over the concentration of Black pupils in particular schools and localities as Black children, the children of those post-war immigrants, began to enter schools for the first time in large numbers. And these concerns were often voiced in terms of the supposed effect that the presence of large numbers of Black children would have on their white peers. So in the mid-1960s, there was an attempt by government to introduce a quota and to say that no school should have more than 30% Black children in its numbers. And the arc shifts again when we come to the mid-1970s, as those children entered adolescence. What happened was that increasing numbers left school and found no work or else poor work. So armies of the young black unemployed became the focus of moral panic. And in the schools, there was simmering conflict. Disproportionate numbers of black boys were excluded, and there were conflicts between black youths and schools and police and black parents. And conflicts between black youth and police erupted in particular in riots in major British cities in 1981 and 85. And those riots historically were pivotal in understandings of race in Britain, not least with regards to schooling. And they prompted a number of major government reports on race, multiculturalism, and education. Now, the British school system did not require the presence of black children in order to reproduce social and educational inequalities. It was more than capable of doing that. It was more than capable already of incorporating working class children into their designated places in the labour process. The problem for black children and parents in the 1960s and 70s was that our education system was not even sure it could achieve that much. And the British school system's dramatic failure of young black people in the 60s and 70s was made more tragic by what their parents, who had migrated from the Caribbean, had in terms of a faith in what Britain's schools might offer their children. Because those parents, remember, had grown up in colonial societies in which education was seen as the route to social mobility. And by the late 1980s, the arc shifts again. By the 1980s, the British education system, like education systems across the West, became increasingly credentialized, closely monitored, and heavily marketized. And in that period, black pupils came to signify underachievement within the system. Yeah, that was the main link, the main thing that black pupils stood for in policymakers' minds was underachievement. Sorry. Okay, that's my alarm to indicate that I'm almost finished. So, black educational failure became a persistent policy theme at that point. And by the early 2000s, in terms of achievement at the age of 16, black Caribbean pupils stood around 15 percentage points behind average. And black boys lagged 12 percentage points behind black girls in their benchmarks. And in the past decade, that gap has seen some shifts up and down, sometimes due to improvements in black people's performance, and sometimes due to changes in the way that success has been benchmarked by government. So, you have an arc that shifts over 50 years, and yet still black children are seen as problems and or victims in our school system. And because they are discursively denied the attributes of historical identity, I would say, or considered behavior or social agency, young black men are too often depicted as underachievers, as non-thinkers, as, and this is a phrase that I heard first in this country, as sub-students. And in my writing, I have tried, therefore, to rethink black education in terms of social agency and to locate black communities in a historical flow which has been characterized by agency in the field of education and characterized elsewhere by what I've described as critical hope. And what I mean by that term, critical hope, is that the educational conditions experienced by black communities in the USA, as in the UK, have engendered a critical realism among black educational activists, and so the transformations for which they continue to work necessitate hope, but of a critical kind. A critical kind of hope that recognizes the challenges, recognizes the difficulties, and yet those difficulties and those challenges do not remove hope from us. Okay. Now, let me finish here and say a little something about some of those early black education campaigns in Britain, because they, in many ways, for better and for worse, set the terms in which we still find ourselves even today. The early black educational campaigns in the 60s, 70s, early 80s in Britain were over dispersal policies, as in this country we had a form of busing, over low teacher expectations, and over the placing of Caribbean children in particular in schools for what were then called they were then called schools for the educationally subnormal. So in the 60s, you had many children who had thrived in Caribbean schools. When they arrived in London, especially, they were placed in schools for the educationally subnormal, for no other reason than they were black and they spoke a different kind of English. And the relatively established black and anti-racist groups of the 60s were slow to turn their attention to the education of black children. And consequently, the key educational struggles of the 60s and 70s were waged most effectively by a new wave of activist groups. And they were influenced by American civil rights struggles, by black power movements, as well as by their home traditions. And they include the black parents movements, the black students movements in London and Manchester. They include the North London West Indian Association. These are all groups that I've explored in some depth in my writing. And pivotal also in that period was the publication of the work of someone called Bernard Cord, whose book, How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System, took that phenomenon of able black children being placed in ESN schools and used it to produce the first ever extended structural analysis of racialized processes in schooling. And in my book, I then go on to produce a kind of map, a cartography of black intellectual activist struggles from the 60s and 70s onwards, including also the work of academics, because people like Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, who are thought of as sociologists, as academics, I would say that although their work is often thought as being somehow separate from the black education struggles of parents and students in places like Hackney and London, in fact, many of the great strides in the work of people like Hall and Gilroy and Hazel Carby actually came out of conditions and concerns akin to those being traversed by the black education movements that were working at a grassroots level in London and Birmingham and Manchester and Leeds and so forth. And those conditions included the limitations of British models of race relations, the policing of black communities, both in the literal and figurative sense, and the marginalization of black histories and cultural work. So, to finish, where are we now in Britain? Still, it would seem our children are victims or problems in most policy perceptions. My colleague Heidi Mirza has argued that decades of superficial discursive shifts through assimilationism, multiculturalism, diversity only conceal patterns of persistent discrimination, and that the more things change, the more things remain the same. Other colleagues of mine who work in the field of critical race theory have gone further, naming the pervasive conspiratorial nature of white supremacy as a constant and arguing that despite the contemporary rhetoric of social justice and cultural diversity, the function of schooling is not to counter racial inequalities, but to maintain them at manageable levels. And those claims may appear pessimistic, but they carry the historical echoes of half a century of black education struggle in Britain. But I want again to emphasize that with that, what may seem on the surface to be pessimism, there is also always critical hope. And that what has characterized black struggles in Britain around education is an intellectual commitment to seeing that critical analysis of race and education does not become the cause for overwhelming, deadening pessimism, but remains the basis of a critical, hopeful realism. Finally, in her book, Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope, Bell Hooks recalls the publication in 1969 of June Jordan's seminal essay, which was called Black Studies, Bringing Back the Person. In that essay, Jordan declared that given the history of race and education in the USA, there was nothing optional about building black studies as an academic field. She's writing here in the early 70s and making that available to African American students and white students alike. And given the post-war histories of black British communities, one might also say there is nothing optional about the project of chronicling the work of black British intellectuals and their role in shaping education and the wider society. At its best, that chronicling can become a contribution to resisting the objectification of black life in educational and social policy discourses. It can be a contribution to refusing the part of problem or victim, to refusing understandings of the education system in which black children are always other people's children. And instead, it can help us to locate black British communities as part of a powerful historical flow of black Atlantic thought and politics. It locates black young people as intellectuals, as social agents, in ways that have potential implications and for approaches to teaching and mentoring and curriculum design. And most of all, I hope this work helps to locate young black people as actors who can, in education, define themselves and redefine the world. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
So at this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Jelando Jackson and Dr. James Moore. Is James in here as well? No? All right, so these are the coordinators of the International Colloquium on Black Males in Education. Dr. James Moore is in the Executive Conference Center. This is Dr. Jelando Jackson. Oh, there we go. All right. So these two gentlemen. Now, real quick, so I've known these brothers. These are well-established, well-accomplished brothers since graduate school. So we sort of came up through the ranks together. They're doing big things, and I'm just happy to be affiliated in the number with them. But just know that the relationships you form in undergrad and graduate school can be carried out over your lifetime of your career. And these are black males, and there's others out there. We work together, we collaborate. This conference sort of comes together. So don't just see the man next to you as just another student. This is potential colleague and lifelong work relationship. So they coordinated this conference. They have a special presentation that they like to provide to our speaker.
Dr. Marks is being very humble. If it not for him, we would not be here, so we appreciate the stage that he's provided for us, and also to Dr. Warmington. At this point, I'd like to ask Dr. Warmington to come and receive our colloquium token that we are providing our keynote speakers, which is a coin that includes our a logo on one side and a message of thank you on the other side. And so, Dr. Warmington.
Thank you. Thank you.
So real quick, this is the third international conference. The first year it was in Leeds, United Kingdom. Last year it was in St. Thomas. This year it's here. The first domestic location in the U.S. is at Morehouse. And next year it'll be at the University of West Indies at Mona. Is that correct? In Jamaica next year. You like that one?